Consider this paradox: a prisoner in chains may be freer than a king who follows every whim. This seeming contradiction reveals something profound about human nature that I discovered during my years of systematic investigation in Königsberg. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want, that is merely license, often leading to the very slavery of our impulses. Real freedom emerges when reason governs our actions, when we act from principles we can rationally endorse rather than being pushed around by desires, social pressures, or external forces. The categorical imperative does not constrain freedom, it reveals what freedom actually means for rational beings. Through pure practical reason, we discover our capacity for moral autonomy, the ability to be self-governing according to universal law. This is humanity's greatest dignity and most revolutionary discovery about our own nature. Today we will explore how reason itself becomes the pathway to authentic liberation, transcending both the bondage of inclination and the heteronomy of external determination. Chapter 1: The Paradox of Rational Constraint. Freedom appears to require the absence of constraints, yet I discovered through decades of critical analysis that the opposite proves true. When we act from immediate desires or social expectations, we become slaves to forces beyond our rational control. The person who cannot resist temptation, who must follow every impulse, who bends to every social pressure, such a person experiences not freedom but the most profound bondage imaginable. During my systematic development of the critical philosophy, particularly through the rigorous examination that led to the critique of practical reason, I recognized that genuine freedom requires the capacity for self-determination through reason. The moral law, expressed in the categorical imperative, does not impose external restrictions but reveals the internal structure of rational autonomy. When I act according to maxims I can will as universal laws, I act from my own rational nature rather than being determined by alien forces. Consider the difference between two responses to moral temptation. One person refrains from lying because they fear consequences, punishment, loss of reputation, social disapproval. This person remains heteronomous, determined by external considerations that may change based on circumstances. Their virtue depends entirely on factors beyond their control and could disappear the moment consequences shift. Another person refrains from lying because they recognize that deception cannot be universalized without contradiction. A world where everyone lies when convenient becomes a world where lying loses all meaning and defeats its own purpose. This second person acts autonomously, from rational principle rather than external constraint. They have discovered something remarkable: moral obligation and freedom coincide rather than conflict. The moral law I impose on myself through reason expresses my deepest freedom rather than limiting it. Through rational autonomy, I become truly self-governing, acting from principles I myself legislate rather than being pushed around by impulses, others' expectations, or consequences I cannot control. The revolutionary insight emerges clearly: what appears as moral constraint actually reveals the structure of genuine liberation. The person who follows rational moral principles experiences a form of freedom unknown to those who simply follow their desires. They become legislators in the kingdom of ends, participating in the universal moral legislation that governs all rational beings. This transforms our understanding of what it means to be free from mere absence of external barriers to positive self-determination through practical reason. Chapter 2: Beyond Animal Nature Through Reason. What distinguishes human beings from other creatures is not our capacity for pleasure, not our intelligence in pursuing goals, not even our sophisticated social cooperation, but our unique ability to act from rational principle rather than natural inclination. This capacity for moral reason elevates us above the realm of natural necessity into the realm of genuine freedom. Animals follow their instincts with perfect reliability and admirable efficiency. A bird builds its nest, a beaver constructs its dam, a wolf hunts its prey, all according to patterns determined by their species' nature. Even the most intelligent animals remain bound by the causal laws governing their behavior, operating through what we might call hypothetical imperatives. If they want to survive, they must hunt. If they want to reproduce, they must build nests. They cannot step back from their impulses and ask whether their actions conform to principles they could rationally endorse for all creatures in similar circumstances. Human beings possess something unprecedented in the natural world, the capacity to evaluate our own maxims through pure practical reason. When I feel the impulse to break a promise for personal advantage, I can subject this inclination to rational scrutiny, asking whether this maxim could become universal law. When I consider whether to help someone in need, I can examine whether my principle respects human dignity and treats the other person as an end in themselves. This ability to subject our actions to rational evaluation reveals our fundamental freedom from natural determination. Yet this freedom comes with profound responsibility that animals never bear. Because we can act from rational principle, we become accountable for our choices in ways that creatures following instinct never are. The person who lies, cheats, or manipulates others cannot claim they had no choice. Their rational capacity creates moral responsibility. They possess the ability to recognize the moral law and choose whether to follow it. Through practical reason, we discover both our elevation above nature and our obligation to act worthy of this elevation. This is why moral education matters so profoundly for human development. We must cultivate our capacity for rational autonomy, strengthening our ability to act from duty rather than inclination. The person who develops this capacity experiences genuine freedom, the freedom to be self-determining rational agents rather than sophisticated animals following complex but ultimately natural patterns of behavior. They join the community of rational beings who can legislate universal moral law through their choices. Chapter 3: The Universalization Test of Freedom. The categorical imperative provides a practical test for determining whether our actions express genuine freedom or merely disguised slavery to inclination. When I ask whether I can will my maxim as universal law, I discover whether my action flows from rational autonomy or from self-serving impulses I am attempting to rationalize through clever reasoning. Consider someone contemplating breaking a promise when keeping it becomes inconvenient or costly. If they attempt to universalize this maxim, break promises when keeping them becomes burdensome, they discover an immediate practical contradiction. A world where everyone follows this principle becomes a world where promises lose all meaning, where the very institution of promising collapses under the weight of universal unreliability. The maxim cannot be coherently universalized without destroying the practice that makes the maxim possible in the first place. This logical analysis reveals something crucial about moral psychology. The person considering promise breaking is not acting from rational principle but from inclination disguised as reasoning. Their reasons for breaking the promise serve their immediate desires rather than expressing principles they could rationally endorse for everyone in similar circumstances. They remain heteronymous, determined by impulses rather than reason, despite their sophisticated rationalizations. Contrast this with someone who keeps difficult promises precisely because they recognize the universalizability of promise-keeping. Such a person acts autonomously, from rational principle rather than inclination or external pressure. Even when keeping the promise involves significant personal sacrifice, even when others might not discover the breach, they experience the freedom of self-determination through reason. They act as legislators in the moral realm, willing laws that could govern all rational beings. The universalization test works because rational beings share the same fundamental structure of practical reason. What I cannot coherently will as universal law reveals the irrationality, and thus the unfreedom, of my proposed action. What I can consistently universalize expresses principles that any rational being could endorse, demonstrating my action's conformity to reason rather than mere inclination or external determination. This is why moral reflection often feels liberating even when it restricts our immediate desires and challenges our comfortable habits. Through the categorical imperative, We discover what we truly will as rational beings, distinguishing this authentic willing from what we merely want as creatures of inclination. Moral duty reveals moral freedom by showing us our capacity for self-legislation through universal principles. Take time now to examine a difficult choice you are currently facing. Apply the universalization test honestly and thoroughly. Can you will your proposed maxim as law for everyone in relevantly similar circumstances? Does this analysis clarify what genuine freedom requires in your situation? Chapter 4: Freedom from Consequences and Results. One of the most profound and liberating aspects of rational freedom is its independence from external outcomes and results. When we act from duty rather than for consequences, we escape the bondage of trying to control what ultimately lies beyond our power, the results of our actions in a complex world full of other agents, unpredictable circumstances, and forces we cannot manage or foresee. The person who tells the truth only when it produces good results remains enslaved to outcomes they cannot guarantee or control. They must constantly calculate consequences, adjust their principles based on expected results, and experience chronic anxiety about whether their actions will achieve desired effects. Such a person never experiences genuine autonomy because their moral choices depend fundamentally on factors beyond their rational control, others' reactions, economic conditions, political circumstances, natural events. In dramatic contrast, the person who tells the truth because honesty can be universalized acts from genuine moral freedom. Regardless of whether truth-telling in a particular case produces happiness, prevents harm, achieves justice, or accomplishes any specific external goal, the honest person acts from rational principle that they can endorse universally. They experience the profound freedom of moral autonomy, the capacity to do what is right independent of external circumstances that may reward or punish their choice. This does not mean consequences are irrelevant to moral life or that we should ignore the welfare of others. We should certainly care about human happiness and strive to promote flourishing wherever possible. But our fundamental moral worth and the authenticity of our freedom depend on the maxims from which we act, not the results we achieve in the external world. Results depend partly on luck, circumstances, timing, and other people's choices. Only our maxims and the rational principles behind them remain fully within our control as autonomous agents. Consider two people who donate generously to charity. One gives because they calculate it will improve their reputation, create useful social connections, provide tax benefits, and enhance their standing in the community. Another gives because they recognize that helping those in need expresses a maxim they can universalize, treating human beings as ends in themselves worthy of support regardless of personal benefit. Both actions may produce identical external results for recipients, but only the second expresses genuine moral freedom and authentic rational autonomy. The freedom to act rightly regardless of consequences is what enables moral heroism in the most difficult circumstances. The person who refuses to participate in injustice even when resistance seems futile, who tells truth to power even when it invites persecution, who maintains integrity even when it costs them significant advantages, such a person demonstrates the supreme freedom of rational autonomy over external pressure and consequential calculation. Chapter 5: The Antinomy of Freedom and Determinism. The deepest philosophical challenge to human freedom appears to be the universal reign of natural causality throughout the empirical world. If every event in nature follows necessarily from prior causes according to unchanging laws, how can human actions be genuinely free rather than merely links in an endless causal chain? This antinomy between freedom and determinism threatened to reduce moral responsibility to a useful illusion until I discovered the transcendental solution through critical philosophy. From the perspective of empirical investigation and scientific understanding, human beings appear entirely subject to natural causality without exception. Our behaviors result from brain states, which result from prior experiences, genetic inheritance, environmental influences, neurochemical processes, and social conditioning. Viewed as phenomena appearing in space and time under the conditions of sensible intuition, our actions seem as determined as any other natural events. This empirical perspective suggests that moral responsibility represents a useful fiction for social coordination but not a metaphysical reality about human nature. However, the transcendental distinction between phenomena and noumena, between things as they appear to us under the conditions of sensible experience and things as they might be in themselves, reveals an entirely different perspective on human action. As moral agents capable of practical reason, we must presuppose that we belong not only to the sensible world of natural causality but also to an intelligible world governed by rational principles rather than mechanical necessity. When I act from duty, following the categorical imperative rather than natural inclination, I exercise a form of causality that operates through reason rather than natural necessity. This represents causality through freedom, the capacity to initiate action based on rational principle rather than being merely the passive result of prior natural causes. The moral law within me demonstrates my participation in an order of existence that transcends natural determinism. This is not a contradiction requiring us to choose between freedom and determinism, but a recognition of our complex dual nature as both empirical and intelligible beings. The same action can be viewed legitimately from both perspectives, as a natural event determined by prior causes and as a moral choice determined by rational principle. The person who helps someone in need can be studied neurologically, psychologically, and sociologically to discover the natural causes of their behavior. But the same action, when done from duty rather than inclination, expresses rational freedom, causality through the moral law rather than natural law. The practical reality of moral freedom becomes evident whenever we engage in genuine moral deliberation about what we ought to do. The very fact that I can ask whether my maxim can be universalized presupposes that I am not merely a natural event but a rational agent capable of self-determination through principle. Moral reflection itself demonstrates our freedom from complete determination by natural causes, revealing our capacity for rational autonomy even within the natural order. Chapter 6: The Postulates of Practical Freedom. The full realization and coherent understanding of moral freedom requires certain presuppositions that extend beyond what theoretical reason can demonstrate but which practical reason necessarily demands for moral life to make complete rational sense. These postulates, freedom, immortality, and God, are not dogmatic assertions or articles of blind faith but rational requirements emerging from serious moral commitment. The postulate of freedom we have already examined extensively. Genuine moral obligation presupposes that we can actually act from duty rather than being completely determined by inclination or external forces. If hard determinism were true and human choices were merely illusions, moral concepts would lose all meaning and rational foundation. Since moral obligation is rationally undeniable, we cannot coherently deny our responsibility without presupposing the very rational capacity we are trying to deny. Freedom must be presupposed as a necessary condition of moral experience. The postulate of immortality emerges from recognizing that moral perfection, complete conformity of our will to the moral law in all circumstances, cannot be achieved within finite temporal existence. Human beings require endless development to overcome the natural inclinations that compete with duty. Yet practical reason demands that virtue and happiness ultimately converge in the highest good, the summum bonum that represents the complete object of practical reason. This convergence requires endless progress toward moral perfection, which is possible only if rational existence continues beyond bodily death. The postulate of God follows from the recognition that in this empirical world, virtue and happiness often diverge dramatically and seemingly permanently. Moral people suffer persecution, poverty, and early death while immoral people prosper through exploitation, deception, and cruelty. Yet reason demands that the highest good, virtue crowned with proportionate happiness, must be possible rather than a meaningless ideal. This requires a moral author of nature, A supreme intelligence who can guarantee that virtue ultimately receives its due reward and that moral effort has ultimate significance. These postulates do not constitute theoretical knowledge in the scientific sense but represent practical faith, rationally justified hope based on moral commitment rather than empirical evidence. I cannot prove theoretically that I am free, that my soul is immortal, or that God exists. But my recognition of moral obligation commits me rationally to these beliefs as necessary conditions for moral life to make ultimate sense and maintain rational coherence. This practical faith liberates us from despair about moral effort in seemingly hopeless circumstances. Even when acting rightly brings immediate suffering, even when virtue seems futile in a world apparently dominated by power and manipulation, practical reason provides rational hope that moral effort connects to a transcendent order that validates rational commitment. The freedom to act rightly is not undermined by uncertainty about temporal consequences because morality points toward an eternal significance that transcends empirical disappointments. Chapter 7: Practical Freedom in Contemporary America. The principles of rational autonomy and moral freedom provide crucial guidance for navigating complex ethical challenges in contemporary American society, from individual life choices to social policy debates. Understanding freedom as self-determination through reason rather than unlimited license to follow desires offers fresh and valuable perspectives on current moral dilemmas that often seem intractable through other approaches. Consider the pervasive realm of technology and social media that shapes so much contemporary experience. Many Americans initially experience these tools as liberating: instant communication across vast distances, unlimited access to information and entertainment, global connectivity that transcends traditional barriers. Yet careful rational analysis reveals new and subtle forms of bondage that may be more dangerous because they appear as freedom. When our attention is captured and manipulated by algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement, when we compulsively check devices in response to engineered psychological triggers, when we shape our behavior and even our thoughts primarily for online approval from strangers, we surrender rational autonomy to external determination by corporate interests. True freedom requires developing principled approaches to technology use that we could universalize, treating digital tools as means to rational ends rather than allowing them to become ends that control our choices and shape our identities. In healthcare ethics, American emphasis on patient autonomy often reduces to satisfying preferences or respecting choices regardless of their rational foundation. But Kantian analysis reveals deeper considerations that enhance rather than restrict genuine autonomy. Authentic freedom requires rational reflection on what we can will universally rather than mere expression of desires. The person making end-of-life decisions exercises true freedom not by following immediate impulses or family pressure but by acting on principles that respect human dignity, both their own and that of others affected by their choice. This approach might support or challenge particular medical decisions, depending on whether they express rational self-determination or mere preference satisfaction. Economic ethics provides another crucial area for applying these insights about rational freedom. American culture often equates freedom with market choice, the ability to buy what we want, sell what we own, enter contracts that serve our perceived interests. Yet this consumer model of freedom can become another form of heteronomy when economic pressures force choices that violate rational principles, when market systems systematically treat human beings merely as means to profit rather than as ends in themselves, when extreme inequality undermines the material conditions necessary for genuine moral autonomy for significant portions of the population. Political participation offers perhaps the most important opportunities for exercising rational autonomy through democratic citizenship. Rather than voting based on tribal loyalty, narrow personal benefit, or emotional manipulation through media campaigns, rational freedom requires evaluating policies and candidates according to principles we could universalize. This might lead to supporting policies that disadvantage us personally but express greater respect for human dignity across society. The American tradition of individual rights resonates powerfully with Kantian autonomy but requires deeper philosophical foundation in rational principle rather than mere assertion or historical precedent. Conclusion. True freedom emerges not from the absence of constraint but from rational self-determination through universal principle that we ourselves legislate. The categorical imperative reveals our extraordinary capacity to transcend natural necessity and social pressure through moral autonomy, the ability to govern ourselves according to laws we can rationally endorse for all. When we act from duty rather than inclination, we experience the profound freedom of rational beings who can participate in the moral legislation of the universe itself. This freedom transforms moral obligation from external burden into self-imposed dignity that honors our rational nature. In recognizing our capacity for practical reason, we discover both our elevation above mere animal existence and our responsibility to act worthy of rational beings capable of moral law. The secret to authentic freedom lies not in doing whatever we want but in wanting what reason demands, treating humanity always as an end, never merely as means. Through this rational autonomy, we become legislators in the kingdom of ends, experiencing the supreme freedom of self-determination through universal moral principle that respects the dignity of all rational beings.